Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Missy Clemens, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of CCWT, the Center for Research on College to Workforce Transitions. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to remind guests that we record all of our webinars and upload them to our website at ccwt.wisc.edu/videos. Also, we appreciate your feedback, so please be sure to complete the evaluation that pops up when you leave this webinar. And with that, I am delighted to be joined today by one of our early career scholars. Dr. Lisa Unangst is an assistant professor of higher education leadership at Empire State University. Her research interests include higher education access and experience among displaced learners, as well as comparative and cross-national constructions of diversity in higher education. She's an associate editor of higher education research and development. Lisa has published in Comparative Educational Review, the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Management, and Higher Education Policy, among other outlets. She served as lead editor of the 2020 Brill Sense publication, Refugees and Higher Education, Transnational Perspectives on Access, Equity, and Internationalization. Lisa is currently working with colleagues on the WT grant-funded project, Cultivating Refugee Access to Higher Education across Maryland, District of Columbia, and Virginia. Welcome, Lisa. And with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I have been so looking forward to this. I'm going to share my slides now. And as I do that, I would like to say that I am really eager to be in conversation with folks moving forward. So I've included on the first slide my email address, and I would love to email with you, set up a phone conversation, a Teams conversation if you're working in this area. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So as mentioned, and again, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I'm going to be speaking today about a recent book of mine with Routledge, which is titled Immigrants and Refugees at German Universities, Diversity, Internationalization, and Anticolonial Considerations. And what I'd like to do in this conversation is start by speaking a little bit about the rationale for this work, some of the research questions that guided the study, conceptual grounding, methodology and methods spanning two phases of work, my findings, and then, of course, discussion and possible areas for future research. So, to offer a bit of information about that rationale, about that background for this study, and put things in context, right? So I think many folks are aware that over the last 10 years or so, and many people identify the Syrian conflict as a key driver of this. The largest global refugee crisis since the end of World War II is unfolding, and it's unfolding in different areas, right? So now we're thinking about displaced people from the DRC, from Afghanistan, Ukraine, of course. And so German higher education institutions do not, though I think many of us have seen Germany and German higher education's institutions in the news with respect to refugee inflows. Universities in Germany do not generally offer supports for enrolled students who have refugee backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds, right? So, what does that mean? Essentially, it means that the student services structures that we're maybe familiar with in the US setting or the Canadian setting, those are not really present in Germany in the same way because of the tuition free context, in part. However, frameworks for diversity and internationalization, I am arguing in this piece, could be made more expansive and offer potentially different types of interventions through an existing office unit, which is kind of like the US Diversity Office. It's called the Equal Opportunity Office in Germany. And I have here on the right just an example of the kinds of logos, images that are often present at German universities. This says, so diverse, Germany is so diverse. These kinds of images are often present at German universities. I mean, I would say ubiquitous, really, but we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into what exactly that means. What does diversity mean in the German higher ed context? And of course, how can we think about it with respect to the mission of CCWT? So, a little bit more detail about this particular study. I was prompted to do this work because of a 2017 pilot study I ran with German university faculty and staff, which was asking about pathway programs for students into higher ed in Germany. Um, Again, Germany, well regarded for the amount of investment into pathways into higher education in comparative context. So there was 100 million euros invested by the federal government just in these programs to get displaced people into German universities. However, concurrently, it's clear from my own work, from the work of colleagues, that there are varied understandings of diversity, race, religious minority status across the country, across institutional units. Again, different kinds of supports for people who hold migrant and refugee backgrounds, and really no supports for students once they enroll. So lots of support to get into university, and then no support once they enroll. Um, to speak a bit about sort of my conceptual grounding for this work, it is indeed a critical project that I'm offering here. This piece takes a critical and a historical perspective in parsing the status quo, and I identify an equity crisis in the German higher education system. I'm crafting here an anti-colonial approach, as has been suggested by Patel, dissecting how power hierarchies operate and proposing specific steps to engage change. Why is this important in the German case? Well, Germany is the world's fourth largest economy. It has a primarily public higher education system, and I make the argument that given its history of coloniality, it is therefore particularly important to consider systemic change that contest racialization and xenophobia. And to provide a little bit of info about, how we can think about comparing the German higher ed and the U.S. higher ed systems, I'm offering a visual here that depicts how do we think about the number of institutions in those two settings. So, basically much smaller number of public and private higher ed institutions in Germany than we see here in the U.S. About a quarter of the German population now identifies a migrant background. So I think that's been true for several years now, but is not maybe widely spoken about. There is a binary system of higher education in the country. So there are universities of applied sciences, as well as research universities that operate alongside each other. There is decentralized funding of higher ed, as is the case in the United States, meaning that the states themselves, in Germany, there are 16 federal states, are primarily responsible for governing the higher ed sector. Again, institutions are generally tuition free or almost tuition free, meaning that there's less money to work with in an institutional budget and that it's meant to be easier to access higher education in Germany. But we'll problematize that a little bit. There is an excellence initiative that has been running for around a decade now in the German context. The goal here is to raise the performance of German universities in the world university rankings, such as the Times Higher Education rankings. And billions of euro have been invested in particular well regarded research universities to get them to the top of those rankings. That does mean that not as much money is being invested in some of the other institutions, which also relates to what we're talking about today, equity in the system. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, important to note that the partial analog of the US Diversity Office, the Equal Opportunity Office, was established in German universities around the 1980s in response to waves of feminist movement. So, a few other key pieces to keep in mind as we talk about this particular system. As I mentioned, there's low tuition or no tuition at German universities, which is meant to facilitate access into the system. However, in Germany and some other countries, there is early tracking in place, which means that around the time of middle school, teachers are involved in a decision, which is meant to be together with parents, to place students into one of several different levels of high school. Traditionally, it's only the highest level high school that would then qualify someone to attend university. This has changed somewhat, but the tracking system remains in place, and it means that access rates are lower than in the United States, for example. Also in Germany, we see the same kind of breakdown in terms of gender participation in the faculty. Um, Essentially lower, right, than would be representative. This is particularly the case at some technical universities, the same in the United States. Some technical universities in Germany employ around 8% women. I mentioned a moment ago that about a quarter of the German population holds a migrant background. What does this mean in terms of higher ed entry? Well, it means that as of 2017, and these numbers don't come out all that frequently, around 13% of university qualified students identified one particular migration background, and that is a background related to the guest worker uh, inflows through the middle of the last century to the end of the last century. Happy to go into more detail about this another time if you're interested. But this was a program that brought migrants for the purposes of labor into the country. So essentially, different rates of access for different types of migrant groups. We see when we're looking at the curricula of German universities a lack of emphasis on African or Asian German studies, right? So there have been calls to revise the curricula to include identity based programs like those. Also, important to note that there are distinct admissions procedures across the universities, and essentially, the more prestigious the university, the more difficult it will be to enter, even though, again, tuition rates are relatively low. So, all of these things, I am arguing, contribute to our understanding of how there are historically situated hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion in this national setting. Um, and I might add, most higher ed staff, most higher ed leadership do not have a close understanding of the diversity of their current students and staff, which relates to the way data is collected and made available in this context. So it's complicated. Um, I wanted to just offer a visualization of the ways in which different federal states in the German context have experienced refugee inflows over the last decade. Without spending too much time on this, the reason I think this is important is similar to the US context, most students will want to attend a university close to home, right? That's the case in Germany as well. And given that there are different concentrations of displaced people across different states, of course, each of which have different funding systems for higher ed, different economies, this means that universities are differently impacted, I would argue, by this current refugee influx. And it means they're presented with different opportunities given those particular circumstances. So, research questions. In phase one of this project, I pursued the following research questions. Number one, at selected German public universities and Fachhochschulen, which are the universities of applied sciences, How do equal opportunity plans reflect goals for marginalized student groups beyond a traditional focus on women? So, those equal opportunity offices, founded in response to feminist activism, initially and often still primarily focus on women alone. Number two, at selected German public universities and Fachhochschulen, how do equal opportunity office faculty and staff interpret their roles in terms of their institution's equal opportunity plan? How does that programming reflect goals for marginalized student groups beyond that traditional focus on women? And how do they do this in light of specific institutional cultures? Now, I mentioned a moment ago that I was drawing in this project from different works. I mentioned Lee Patel, and what I'm attempting to do here in interrogating coloniality in the German higher ed system is to focus on inequitable power structures inherent to this primarily public system that I and others have argued reproduces Eurocentrism and frames German as white and Christian. Therefore, sensitizing concepts of this work include power, hierarchy, and hybridity. I wanted to provide a few examples of again, ways in which we might think about this playing out, right? Coloniality in Germany as a whole, coloniality in higher education. There are certainly examples from the last few years as well, but these are a few that I think stand out. In 2010, in a European survey, and I provide the reference here if you're interested in taking a look at this, Germans held negative opinions of Muslims more so than the average across Europe by 20 points. In 2015, in a much discussed example of coloniality, the University of Bremen received a proposal by scholars to found a Black Studies department. I mentioned that those don't really exist in the German context. The proposal did not engage any scholars of color. This has since been cited by people across disciplines as an example of coloniality, racism, um, and xenophobia across the sector. So, methods and methodology. As I mentioned, this book project, took place in two phases. Phase one engaged constructivist grounded theory in looking at equal opportunity plans and in looking at interview transcripts. And that involved a process of iterative coding, memo writing, and theoretical integration that all led to the development of a theoretical model. Of course, constructivist grounded theory proposed by Sharmaz is ontologically relativist, it's subjectivist, it situates the researcher as directly tied to a project's findings, right? So anyone looking at similar questions would therefore produce quite a different result. I argue that constructivist grounded theory was indicated in this project because of a scarcity of data and the need for qualitative work on processes of change, arguing that diversity, refugee inflows, dynamic funding of the higher education system all reflect dynamic processes of change. In phase two, I drew from quantitative textual analysis, and in particular, used a product called Voyant, which Rockwell and Sinclair elucidated in this book that you see pictured here with MIT Press. Rockwell and Sinclair have described Voyant as a web-based set of tools that allow a user to index and correlate words in documents, so, speeches or equal opportunity plans, as well as web pages. So, a web page produced by the US government or the German government. That text can be analyzed by this open source tool. Data are visualized through the tool using word clouds, distribution graphs, word or phrase frequency indicators, bubble charts, And it's possible to identify the correlation and significance of any grouping of two words. So, for example, diversity and student, right? You could find how those words are correlated across a single diversity plan or a grouping of diversity plans if you were interested in doing that. A key limitation, which Rockwell and Sinclair point to, is that, of course, this tool doesn't reflect on intentionality of a particular author, and it also strips context, right? It strips national context, institutional context. So it's up to the person interpreting results to consider those. And what did I do specifically in this study? In phase one, I used stratified random sampling, considering all public universities and universities of applied sciences in the German context to identify 16 of each. Each represented a different federal state, again, keeping in mind the decentralized higher ed system. I more or less tried to evenly distribute these institutions across rural, suburban, and urban areas using some benchmarks for those areas, drawing from government standards. And I pulled the equal opportunity plans from each of these institutions. I also sought to interview equal opportunity staff at each of these institutions. In phase two of this project, which took place in 2022, I considered again all of the public institutions in question. I tried to pull the equal opportunity plans available at that time, so several years later, was able to identify 21 active, so current equal opportunity plans that were publicly available, meaning not behind a password protected page. Um, these plans reflected 11 research universities and 10 universities of applied sciences. They also reflected 14 federal states, so, not the full national scope. And just a preview of some of the things I found in that particular analysis using, again, Voyant, I found that the use of words beginning with ras, which is the equivalent of race, right, the root of the word, those words were used 69 times total across these 21 documents, as compared to 105 mentions of words beginning with migration and over 1,000 words beginning with international. Um, I will move right along to share that in looking at full plans, it's important to keep in mind that there are really very different formats and lengths of equal opportunity plans presented by universities in the German context. Sometimes these are titled equal opportunity plans. Sometimes they're titled concepts, concept maps, sometimes action plans, in some cases, women's advancement plans, right? These are the single standalone plans. In work focused on the US setting, we find also variation in how these types of documents are titled, but perhaps not quite as wide a variation. And I just refer here again to how plans were included, that they needed to be current, available online without a password. This piece offers an indication again of how plans were situated across urban, suburban, and rural contexts, how they were situated across research universities and universities of applied sciences. This is relevant to phase one. And to talk a little bit about the findings of that constructivist grounded theory, the data analysis and the coding, of course, I moved through, as suggested by Sharmaz, a process of constant comparative method. This indicates a process moving from initial coding to focused coding and then theory building. Some of the focused codes that were used in this project included identifying budget limitations, making a claim to town university collaboration, promoting funded research opportunities for women. And what did I find, right? What were these overarching results indicating? Well, I argue that they were indicating three things: that there's currently a construction of diversity as gender in the German university context, diversity as supplementary task, and diversity as statistic. And to share a bit about what I mean by each of these, diversity as gender is reflected, I argue, through selective implementation of legal frameworks. So, without going into too much detail, there are a number of federal and state level pieces of legislation that indicate attention to equality across different identity markers, right? And I think it's clear that to date, this particular unit at German universities, the Equal Opportunity Office, has interpreted these documents in such a way so as to prioritize service of women, to prioritize gender as they construct programs and policies. Now, it's also very clear that equal opportunity officers see an ongoing and an urgent need for their work. They do not see the task of gender equity as solved in the German context by any means. Um, there is an emphasis on the gender binary across the documents and the interviews that I analyzed as part of this project. And in particular, there's a preference to focus on programming that support women as mothers. There's also repeated mention across these documents of personal motivation or persönliche Motivierung among women researchers who are moving through the academic ladder. And this I would problematize, right? I think we need to think critically about how this positions the individual versus the exclusionary context in which they are situated. Diversity is statistic. So it is very clear from the documents and the interviews conducted that reporting is a vast compliance function for these partial equivalent of diversity offices, right? So staff members are tasked with reporting numbers from across the university in terms of staff, student, and faculty participation, hiring procedures. It's so elaborate that in many cases, something like 80% of the plans themselves were taken up with charts and graphs indicating the collection of figures, the reporting of figures. And I call this a compliance function in line with other folks working in this field, right? This leads to a consideration, I think, of diversity as performance, right? Can we understand compliance as performance or the reporting of data as performance? What does it mean if time is taken up in that reporting instead of time spent on generating programs or eliciting feedback, for example, from students or marginalized staff, faculty, and community members about what they might like to see? So I contrast this with a more expansive process of reckoning, right? What I think we're seeing here is an emphasis on equality, not equity. And then diversity is a supplementary task, I argue, is reflected by limited budgets. In some cases, equal opportunity offices have a single part time staff member, a pervasive lack of student input on the work that's being done, whether that's programming, policy work, etc. I think that there's an emphasis in many of the plans and the interviews on this term sensitization. That this is one of the roles of the office. They are to sensitize students, staff, and faculty with respect to diversity and equality. But there's very rarely any operationalization of what exactly sensitization means, which I think indicates that it is not at the core of the institution's operations. It's also very clear that there's more budget being allocated, more staff roles, for example, to internationalization across these institutions rather than diversity. And to provide a quote that I think emphasizes this issue, diversity as supplementary task. This is from one of the equal opportunity officers I interviewed. They said, "I'm actually working on the new equal opportunity plan this week. It's more than 50 or 60 pages. We know that nobody will read it, but we can say, look here at this action plan. You see how it has to be done. Please regulate this process or please do it another way." So I think what we're seeing here is an understanding of one of these officers that their work is on the periphery of the organization, and also some very set guidelines for the type of work that is considered acceptable by members of that office. All in all, I did draw from these two phases of work to develop a theoretical model for equal opportunity at German higher ed institutions that draws together, as you can see here at the top of the screen, consideration of a tuition-free context imbued with coloniality, as well as a legal framework for diversity and equal opportunity that offers the potential for expansive work. I identify what I call a bureaucracy of equal opportunity that interacts with both sensitization and consciousness raising, which I think we need to problematize, as many other scholars have argued, and a reporting, an emphasis on improving numbers in some way, though that is often undefined. And this results in, I argue, an isolation and diffusion of migrant and refugee support. So, coming back together, then, thinking sort of big picture, what does it all mean? How can we understand this? Again, I would argue the German case is something of a paradox. Um, the highest number of migrants and refugees in Europe, by some measures, the highest European GDP, for example, and yet we see across colleges and universities a single unit supporting enrolled students who identify as marginalized, and that unit tends to support only one particular marginalized group, cisgendered women. So, how do we think about moving forward then? How do we move beyond what I have called numerification of diversity? I think we need to draw attention to a lack of resources being dedicated to the context, the formerly colonial, some would argue now post colonial context, with varied state demographics and university histories. We need to focus on how reporting numbers alone obscures emphasis on power and hierarchy. We need to think carefully about what we mean by data privacy in this setting, and how it can inhibit participatory work. We need to think about supporting hybrid student identities through participatory approaches, and to think about whether, in the German context, as argued elsewhere, gender is easier to address through these sorts of institutional channels than race or migrant status. I'd like to offer here a reflection by Klein from 2016. This author wrote, "What remains underdeveloped in Germany because of missing historical precursors is a diversity approach that takes into account that inequality is more than just unequal numbers in the student body." So, again, moving beyond numerification. I think it's possible that the model I've developed may be relevant in other national contexts with increasingly diverse student populations, including refugee inflows, histories of colonial possession or fantasy, and primarily public higher ed systems. And these might include Colombia, Canada, France, and Japan, among others. I also think it's really critical, and to come back to the mission of CCWT, really critical, and I do write about this in the book, to think about how programs, policies, and procedures already in use in the German context can be expanded to support refugee learners or displaced learners. And here are a few suggestions. I think it's clear that existing websites, like the website of the German Rectors Conference, that are, offering some information at a centralized national level, that those could be expanded to support students from different backgrounds as they consider different courses of study and different universities, and the funding mechanisms and support mechanisms that would go along with pursuing study at those particular institutions. Prior learning assessment is in place at some institutions in the country, as elsewhere. it clearly could be expanded to serve displaced learners. In many cases would reduce cost, right, for learners who are able to take advantage of prior learning assessment. Higher education staff training programs are perhaps not as pervasive in the German context as elsewhere. So in the US, we're familiar with, masters of higher ed programs, masters of student affairs programs. I used to teach in one at Ohio University. Um, and and yeah, so not as pervasive, but there are some. And I think considering the curricula of those programs is going to be vitally important moving forward. In particular, how do we think about these populations, these diverse groupings of learners, and how do we think about not just what's happening, on the campus itself, right, but around the campus as learners are thinking about those workforce transitions, right? How do we support students in exploring possible career paths through things like service learning, internships, job shadowing with alumni? Those kinds of systems do exist, right? And they can be amplified. And then I would suggest a cross national comparison of relevant work in all of these areas is going to be helpful for researchers, policymakers, members of the system alike. Internship programs, workforce pathway programs for displaced learners look very different in different national contexts. And it's important for institutions to have an awareness of good practices in this area, right, as they consider scaling. I'd love to open it to, have a larger conversation now. Any questions or comments that you have? Again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing your insights. It's super fascinating to hear your work and all you've learned in Germany. And, it's especially fascinating because I don't hear much about Germany. In all the research that I hear like most of what I've heard in CCWT has been among populations here in the United States with diverse learners and even displaced learners. And then I've heard different countries in Africa because there are a lot of funders who are doing work. And it's funny because they don't even name the countries. They'll say Africa,
Wow.
which is funny because people
Yeah.
aren't as educated, but they'll just say Africa. And then I hear China a lot because, of course, there are a lot of researchers in China that people partner with. So it is fascinating to hear what you're doing in Germany. So are there others that you've connected with who are doing work in Germany? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. And, I just wanted to say with respect to this, the point you just made, it is really interesting. I think there have kind of been like two sort of separate streams of work on refugee education in the past. And one has been focused on what's sometimes called education in emergencies. So people who are in refugee camps, for example, or in a neighboring country, even internally displaced people, right? How are they gaining access to some form of education? And then there's this piece about, how do we think about access to higher education wherever that takes place for displaced learners? And actually, the UN has prioritized this with a goal of 15% participation in the coming years. We're currently at 7% of refugees worldwide accessing higher education. But yeah, what are other folks doing? So, what's really exciting is that the German government does continue to invest pretty heavily in some promising structures. For example, there is an institute on national discrimination in Germany, which has received federal funding and is running all kinds of surveys and studies. I would say primarily looking at labor market participation and voting participation. Now, they're not maybe as focused on like that education to workforce pathway as I think they could be, but we might see that evolve moving forward, given the number of resources that are in place. And there is now an officer for anti-racism in Germany, a federal level role. So, it's going to be very interesting and important to see how this investment of resources at that level influences the decentralized higher ed system.
Imagine that, an anti-racism, right?
Yeah.
What would that be like? Um, yeah, just thinking about, sorry, I'm processing, and I've said this
Yeah.
in other webinars. I
Oh my
tend to have
gosh.
to process, and it's funny because
No,
it's always like 2 days after a webinar that I'm like, "Ooh, I wish I had asked that." Um,
I talked about so many different parts of German
no,
economy and education. I completely understand, and I'd love to keep talking anytime.
no, it has my wheels spinning because, and we've talked too about, our work has grown from college to workforce, right? But the implications are far wider than that. We've talked about even apprenticeships, which even though it's not college to workforce necessarily, there's an education component to it. And so we've
Mhm,
talked about expanding to that and looking at you know, how we can, you know, investigate and help improve access to not internships, apprenticeships and other types of work-based learning because, increasingly, the value of education is under scrutiny. And so, um, and we already know that access to opportunity is in all types of opportunities, um,
mhm, mhm.
is is tends to be there's a lot of disparity. Let's just put it that way in
Yeah,
who has access to certain opportunities. And so
yeah.
we've definitely talked about, what are different things that we could do to make an impact because that's our mission, right? Our mission is to improve those outcomes of young people. And even we talked about maybe it's not just the young people transitioning.
Right.
How do we improve that for people? Especially those who have been historically marginalized and excluded from the labor market and education. And people who want to, access education and haven't been able to. How do we impact that? And so
Mhm.
I love what you've learned, and I love the idea that maybe we could learn something from Germany. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but you've definitely given us some ideas, right? Yeah,
Oh, thanks. Well, I mean, I totally, I think this is the piece about drawing from different national examples that can be so helpful because one of the things that I think is clear in other national settings is that having paired language learning with these kinds of job exploration opportunities can be really supportive of
hmm,
learner outcomes. And so, what would that look like in the US, for example, right? Um, Depending on what age a student is, they might be getting some English language learning support at a high school. It could be a community college. It could be a volunteer based community nonprofit, right? And
yeah,
some of those groups might be involved with apprenticeships and some of them might not be. And
yeah,
the people who are offering those programs might be tied into the apprenticeships or they might not be. So
yeah,
how do we think about, again, like bridging these barriers? And I think some of it is staff training, right? Like
yeah,
thinking about what are the opportunities for individuals to break down those barriers within their organizations.
yeah. Well, yeah, and just connecting. How do we and I think part of it can be resources, right? Like I think unfortunately, um, a lot of especially community agencies just don't have resources. So it's really hard to make those connections and it's getting worse. And so, I'm
Yeah.
thinking about right now we're in the middle of our annual giving campaign because, it's that time of year. And so it's more important than ever right now if you can, and not everybody can, and I respect that, but even $1 helps. And we say that, like, if you can give like $1, you don't realize it, but that can help. But I'm not here to get on that soapbox, but just to say, like, I think more and more we're relying on individuals giving instead of what used to be public funds used to go to community agencies, and it's not anymore. And so those resources just aren't there to help those agencies make the connections like that's happening in Germany where they're pairing those things.
Yeah.
And so how can we get creative around that, to make it easier, to ease those connections, kind of to grease the wheels. And so that's an idea too, is, maybe it's organizations like CCWT, like maybe that's an idea for a grant, like
Yeah,
it's,
absolutely.
or other, maybe there's research around that, like a project around,
Yeah.
you know, so yeah, all great things.
And I mean, first of all, I love that idea for a grant proposal. I hope we keep talking about this. But let me give like another example in the US. In a different study that I did that was with community-based organizations who were supporting refugee learners and mostly supporting adults who were refugees. They told me about a hospital in their local area that was experiencing such a terrible staffing shortage that
Mhm.
they said, we not only would like to hire some folks with refugee background, particularly if they have a background in an allied health field. So we'd like to hire them, but we're also going to pay for them to go to school because we want them to stay with us and get those US degrees so they don't have to deal with there's a lot of trouble with getting
Wow. Yeah.
transferred from different countries. And those are the kinds of sites that I think would offer English language classes on site,
Well,
right?
exactly. I'm going
So,
to tell you,
mhm,
I know a man who opened up his own nail salon and was doing pedicures. He was a physical therapist in his home country.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. And again, we talk about this all the time, shortages of doctors, nurses, PTs, right? And yeah, these are
But
well.
we don't make an easy pathway for people. And by the time I met him, he was speaking English well, but I'm sure that the language barrier was a big part of it when he first came here. And he was a very sweet man. And by then he's, now he's like retirement age, and he does it, I think, for fun. He likes to go in there and socialize. But when he first came here, that wasn't it. It was that there was no easy way for him to, I mean, and at that point they weren't requiring the doctorate, but he would have had to basically start from scratch to get his PT in the United States.
Right.
So it is interesting. There's a lot of potential there, Lisa. So I think we can definitely learn a lot from some of this work that's being done by researchers like you.
Well, that is so kind of you to say. Thank
Yeah.
you so much. It's been really just wonderful to be able to talk with you today about this. Again, I'm so grateful for your time and wishing everybody a happy holiday season.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and have a great afternoon.
You
And for
too.
anybody that's joined us today, please be sure to click on that survey that pops up if you close out the webinar. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
You too. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.